Fellas, obviously this week is UFC 303 O'Malley versus Merab, but to be honest, this might be one of the worst cards we've had top to bottom from a pay-per-view this year in its entirety. Despite it being hyped up as it's going to be the next big thing in the UFC, the next big pay-per-view since UFC 300, one of the most stacked cards this year, an unmissable pay-per-view in the Sophia that's going to be one of a lifetime, is what Dana White has been calling this fight, even before the card got announced and the fight's got announced. So we're going to be taking a look at UFC 303 as a whole, and why it's genuinely one of the most disappointing cards we've had this year. I mean, listen, the main three fights in this card, from the featured fight to the main event, I have no problem with. I think Sean O'Malley versus Merab is a really interesting fight. It's one of the most hyped fights I've been in a while. Well, hyped I've been for a fight in a while, especially in the bantamweight division. Wrestler versus striker, they both look unstoppable. That's a really good main event. Any pay-per-view that you put that on, it's going to be a great fight. And the co-main event, again, I'm not a massive hater of the matchup. I don't want to see it in, a fourth time. I don't want this to be some Moreno versus Figueiredo quadrilogy, but I'll happily take it a third time. It's probably one of the more interesting female fights out there. And then for Brian Ortega versus Diego Lopez, again, another good fight that they've added to this card. The matchmakers obviously did well with the main three fights. I've been waiting for this fight since it got cancelled in UFC 303. I really like the fight. I think it's going to be a banger. Big opportunity for Diego Lopez. So the main three fights in this card, from the featured fight to the main event, I have no problem with, and I think the matchmakers did a really good job at shaping this card up. But it's almost as if after these three fights got made, the matchmakers went home or just left the rest of the card to be a steaming pile of dog shit, because the rest of the main card, Daniel Zeluba versus Ribovics, Ronaldo Rodriguez versus Odi Osbourne. Odi Osbourne on the main card in 2024. I mean, first of all, Daniel Zeluba, he's 3-1 in the UFC, and he's managed to make it on the main card of one of the most stacked pay-per-views this year. And even worse, Ribovics, listen, he had that really good KO over Terence McKinney a couple of months ago. It was a really good knockout, but he's 2-1 in the UFC, and he's made it to the main card of a pay-per-view. And like I said, his opponent's Daniel Zeluba. And if that wasn't the main problem on this card, Ronaldo Rodriguez, Odi Osbourne, is on a main card of a pay-per-view in 2024. The guy that has lost more fights in the UFC than he has won is in a main card of a pay-per-view. Odi Osbourne, one of the worst flyweights going, has made it to the main card, and he's going to be taking on Ronaldo Rodriguez, a guy who's 1-1 in the UFC and lost on the Contender Series years ago as well. So the main card already, if you take away the main three fights, is already super disappointing. It's not even like some Alex Moreno versus Nico Price action, because at least at one time they were, fairly decent names. These are just complete, they're not even up-and-comers. They haven't even built themselves up enough to be an up-and-comer yet. Put them on like the Fight Night main cards. That, to be the main card of one of the most stacked pay-per-views this year, or at least so-called, is disappointing. But it's not even just the main card that's the problem. It's the rest of the card. I mean, first things first, there's only 10 fights on the entire card, which is significantly less than most pay-per-views. So we already got a shortage of fights, and they haven't even stacked it all. I mean, apart from Aldana, Torres, Joshua Van, and Raul Rosas Jr., the rest of the fighters in the prelims, in my opinion, really make the card disappointing. There's only 2 ranked fighters in the entirety of the prelims, and there's obviously the first 2 fights opening up the main card. None of those guys are ranked either. So I'm going to be going through some fights that I think the UFC should have added to UFC 306. The fights that I think if the UFC strategically planned, they could have made for this UFC 306 card, rather than the steaming pile of dog shit that we've got. Because again, it's been hyped up as this really good card, the Sophia, one in a lifetime. We never go in there again. It's super expensive. At least make the card pretty good. It seems like they've spent all the money on the Sophia just to make the card lackluster. But anyway, the first fight I've got for this card, it seems like a bit of a no-brainer. And it should have been Brandon Moreno versus Amir Albazi, the #1 contender fight, or at least maybe, a big fight in the flyweight division. Now, I know they've just been announced for November, so we are getting this fight regardless, but it would have been a no-brainer to put this on the Sophia. Brandon Moreno from Mexico, put it on the Sophia. I think if you told Brandon Moreno you want to fight on the biggest Mexican pay-per-view we've had in a while, on the one-in-a-lifetime pay-per-view in Sophia, the card that's getting hyped up as UFC 300 Part 2, I know Moreno said he wanted to take a break, but I don't think he would get rid of the opportunity of fighting on the Sophia just so, 2 months later he can fight Amir Albazi in a Fight Night main event. So I think if you'd have told Moreno where he's fighting, the card that he's on, and just the occasion that he's fighting on, I don't think Moreno would have rejected it against Amir Albazi. And it's a big fight as well. Like I said, Brandon Moreno, former flyweight champion, literally paved the way for Mexican MMA. The first Mexican-born UFC champion in history isn't fighting on arguably the biggest pay-per-view in Mexico history. I don't understand where the logic is. It would have been a no-brainer to put Brandon Moreno on this card. And I just don't get it, man. Having him a Fight Night main event against Amir Albazi a few months later, when it could have been on this big pay-per-view, in which I think Brandon Moreno has a really good chance of beating Amir Albazi as well. And even if Amir Albazi wins, listen, if Amir Albazi can beat Brandon Moreno, he's probably going to be fighting for the belt next. It can be classed as a #1 contender fight, at least for Amir Albazi, on another big pay-per-view. And again, if Brandon Moreno wins, he's had the first win in ages. in front of his home fans in Mexico on a big pay-per-view. It would have been a no-brainer to do Brandon Moreno versus Amir Albazi. Just have it as like the featured fight on the card, just before Alexa Grasso versus Valentina Shevchenko. That alone would have made the main card infinitely better than what the dog shit is now. Having Audi Osborne as a flyweight on the main card and not Brandon Moreno or Amir Albazi, in my opinion, is criminal. So Brandon Moreno, Amir Albazi, it should have been on the main card of UFC 306. It was a no-brainer. It doesn't even have to be Amir Albazi, just Brandon Moreno against anyone. The guy who paved the way for Mexican MMA isn't even on the biggest Mexican pay-per-view we've had in ages. So that's the first fight that I think should have been added to the main card of UFC 306. And I know Moreno said he wanted to take a break, so maybe it's not the UFC's fault, but I have a hard time believing that Moreno would have rejected a main card slot on a pay-per-view of UFC 306 just to fight in a fight night main event 2 months later against Amir Albazi. Anyway, the next fight that I think should have been added to this card is actually quite a big fight, and it's Dominick Cruz versus Mario Bautista. Again, I know Mario Bautista is matched up against Jose Aldo, but if the UFC was smart, they would have at least tried to do Jose Aldo versus Henry Cejudo for UFC 307, which is an infinitely bigger fight. I think everyone would want to see two legends in Aldo and Cejudo go at it, rather than seeing Aldo and Mario Bautista. No disrespect to Bautista, by the way. That's why I've matched him up against Dominick Cruz on this card. I think this was a bit of a no-brainer. Dominick Cruz coming off a loss, needs to fight down. Mario Bautista, up-and-comer, fighting an old legend. I think this makes more sense than Mario Bautista versus Jose Aldo, so I think Cruz versus Bautista should have been on the main card as well. Cruz hasn't fought in ages. His last fight was all the way back in 2022 when he got knocked out by Marlon Vera with that head kick, and he's been out ever since. He's been hinted a 2024 comeback, but it doesn't seem like he is going to be coming back this year. And he's got Mexican descent, so I guess he can get the whole Mexican fans on his side as well. Dominick Cruz versus Mario Bautista. You know, it's a massive fight as well for the main card of this big pay-per-view. Dominick Cruz, the greatest bantamweight of all time on this card. The big return of Dominick Cruz after being out the octagon for 2 years. We're going to see how he does when he comes back and faces an up-and-comer in Mario Bautista. The big return of Dominick Cruz on UFC 306. It made the more sense, and it's going to be kind of cool to see Sean O'Malley, who people think is going to be the future greatest bantamweight of all time, on the same card as Dominick Cruz, who most would regard as the current greatest bantamweight of all time. So, Cruz versus Bautista, I think this would have been the strategic plan to put on UFC 306 over Bautista versus Aldo at 307, and then just make UFC 306 lackluster. And listen, if Mario Bautista does win, who cares, man? The dude's on a big streak anyway. The dude's on a big streak. He's the dark horse of the bantamweight division, and I think if he can go out there and beat Dominick Cruz, he's done it on a massive pay-per-view on UFC 306 on the Sophia, and he would have made a name for himself in the bantamweight division. So Dominick Cruz versus Mario Bautista. Again, nobody wants to see Aldo versus Mario Bautista. I think Aldo, he's coming off a win as well. Aldo's just beaten Jonathan Martinez. Why does he have to face another up-and-comer in Bautista? Makes no sense. Dominick Cruz, Mario Bautista should have been on the main card of UFC 306. Again, I'm not saying the UFC had full control to do this, because Dominick Cruz probably would have rejected it, but if they could have made this fight, or at least he should have tried to make this fight, that would have been the smart option to do. Anyway, the next fight I've got on this card isn't between a legend, but it's rather between two up-and-comers and two big prospects, or at least one big prospect and an ex-prospect. Peyton Talbert versus Adrian Yanez. Now, I'm pretty sure this fight is going to happen eventually, but I feel like UFC 306 would have been the perfect place to make this fight. Two up-and-comers on a big pay-per-view like UFC 306. You've got Peyton Talbert, who's probably the biggest prospect right now in the bantamweight division. A ton of hype to his name. His hype is only growing after every fight, and he took no damage in his last fight. Went out there and knocked him out in 20 seconds. He took no damage, so it's not like going from 303 to 306 is a crazy quick turnaround or anything like that. It ain't no Gene Silver action, and like I said, he's a big prospect. Destroyed Cameron Simon, knocked out Yanis Gamora in 20 seconds. I think him versus Adrian Yanez is the fight to make next, and I think it would have made a lot of sense to do it on UFC 306. Peyton Talbot even called out Adrian Yanez in this fight after he beat Yanis Gamora, and I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to see this matchup. Even Adrian Yanez entertained the fight online as well, so I think this should be next, and I think this should have been this could have been a perfect fight to put in UFC 306, and for Adrian Yanez, the dude was once in the same position of Peyton Talbot. This big, up-and-coming prospect, this scary striker who was getting win after win with a ton of hype to his name. Eventually, he did get fraud-checked when he got knocked out by Rob Font and eventually, obviously, lost to Jonathan Martinez. But he was still a big prospect at one point in a very similar position to Peyton Talbot. And I think regardless of who wins, we could have the future of the bantamweight division in this fight. The future may be Peyton Talbot. If he can beat Adrian Yanez, he's going to have a shit ton of hype to his name. If Adrian Yanez can fraud-check Peyton, well, maybe not fraud-check, but shut down the hype of Peyton Talbot, he's going to have a shit ton of more hype to his name because he's already coming off a knockout as well, and I think he could get a big fight in the bantamweight division. Peyton Talbot, Adrian Yanez, two big prospects, display them on a big card, get the world watching them like UFC 306, because again, it is the next big, well, these guys could be the next big thing for the bantamweight division, and again, the comparisons between O'Malley and Peyton Talbert are never ending. Have them on the same card, let's watch them at the same time on the same card. Sean O'Malley and Peyton Talbot on the same card, so Peyton Talbot, Adrian Yanez, I think this fight should happen next regardless of what card it's on, but I feel like it should have been on UFC 306. It's not a massively quick turnaround for both of them, and like I said, Talbot didn't even get, his last fight was 20 seconds long against Yanis Gamore, took no damage, went out there, got the job done and left. Talbot, Yanez, would have made a lot more sense to put on UFC 306. But anyway, the next fight I've got on this card is a fight that was actually originally scheduled to be on UFC 306, and then the UFC fumbled the matchup, and it is Anthony Hernandez versus Michel Pereira. This fight had everything going for it. The fact that the UFC fumbled this matchup by not doing the correct contract negotiations really, really stung this card, because this is one of the most, out of all the Fight Night main events we've got up and coming this year, this is definitely the one I'm looking forward to the most. So, but if they was to put this on UFC 306, I might have not even made this video because I'd have thought I was being ungrateful. Anthony Hernandez versus Michel Pera is one of the most interesting matchups you can make in the UFC. The two best prospects in the middleweight division right now that happen to be ranked going at it. A great grapple. Well, they're both well-rounded, to be honest, but a great grappler in Anthony Hernandez versus Michel Pereira. This is such a good fight, and I really feel like they missed out by not putting this on UFC 306. Anthony Hernandez, this grappling prospect who just mauled Roman Kopylov. A guy that's on a streak, a guy that's got a ton of hype, a guy that could potentially be the future of the middleweight division. Going against Michel Pereira, one of the most entertaining middleweights on the roster right now, a guy that is super fun to see, a guy that's well-rounded, does flashy shit every fight and knows how to get the crowd going. This was the perfect fight to put on UFC 306, and again, the UFC fumbled it. I don't know how they fumbled it with the contract negotiations, but Hernandez versus Michel Pereira should have been on this card. Again, it doesn't really make sense to postpone it, and again, the winner of this fight, I mean, it's just a good fight. You've got Michel Pereira, this well-rounded middleweight who's going out there and finishing people, and seems like he's hit a whole new wave in his UFC career after he made that move to middleweight, against Anthony Hernandez, this dangerous grappling prospect who just destroyed Roman Kopylov. This fight had everything going for it. It's a fight that I can't wait for. Even in the Fight Night main event, I still can't wait for it, but it should have been on UFC 306. The UFC fumbled it by not putting it on UFC 306. And the winner of this fight could have easily had like a top 6 opponent or top 5 opponent. I said this before. I think the winner of this fight should face Marvin Vettori. And this could have been like similar to like Caio Bravo versus Jared Cannonier, where the winner of this fight gets a nasty fight after this. So Hernandez versus Michel Pereira. UFC fumbled this by not putting this on UFC 306. They actually started off really strong when they made this, when they announced this fight, and then to let it go really took a hit to this card, because what's the replacement for this? Audie Osborne versus Ronaldo Rodriguez. So that's another fight that I think the UFC fumbled. And then the next fight I've got is Vicente Luque versus Nick Diaz. Now, I know I've said multiple times before, I'm not a big fan of this matchup, and I know it was scheduled before for UFC Abu Dhabi, but it seems like the way that the UFC are going, they are going to reschedule this matchup. I have no idea when, but they've said that they are going to reschedule it. So I thought, if you're going to reschedule it, just do it for UFC 306. Get it out the way. Stop making Nick Diaz wait longer than he has to wait. Let's just get the fight over and done with, and put it on UFC 306. Nick Diaz, the big return of a UFC legend. Everyone's going to be hyped to see, well, maybe not everyone, but people might be happy to see Nick Diaz, as again, another guy with Mexican heritage as well. Him versus Vicente Luque. If you're going to reschedule that fight, do it for this card. Nick Diaz versus Vicente Luque. Get it over and done with. The return of Nick Diaz. The return of Vicente Luque. He hasn't fought in a while either. Do it for UFC 306. Get it out the way. Rather than postponing it for some dodgy fight night later on in the year, just get it over and done with. Again, Nick Diaz, a fan favourite. Another legend to put on UFC 306. A card that's full of legends and prospects as well. There's everything going for this card had they done Luque versus Nick Diaz. So I think that should have been the fight. If they are going to reschedule it, again, the perfect opportunity. It's not like they just had a massive wake cut for UFC Abu Dhabi as well. The wake cut didn't even happen in the first place. So what the card could have been was a really good card. This is the crap that we got presented with. This was the absolute crap that we've been presented with for this week. And again, like I said, there's a couple of good fights on there, but the majority of the card is just crap, and there's only 10 fights. And it could have been this. Again, I'm not saying every single fight could have gone through, but theoretically, if the UFC would have played the cards right, it could have been looking something similar to this, where there's so many fun fights on there, and they should have made the most out of the 10 fights they've got. So that's my overall thoughts on UFC 306 this week. I'm still going to watch it. There's still a couple of good fights on there, but they really fumbled the bag with what could have been a great card, and it seems like the whole hype surrounding this card is not the fight and the fighters, but the Saphira itself. So let me know your thoughts on UFC 306 in these matchups, and thank you for watching.